Can artificial intelligence improve actual human intelligence? We've got a great panel today. I'm Steve Goodman. I'll be your moderator for the next 49 minutes. I'm a partner with Toba Capital. We're a venture firm focused in San Francisco, focused on artificial intelligence and education, HR technology stuff. I'm also the CEO of a company called Restless, Bandit, where we focus on HR technologies and sourcing and recruiting. So let me just go through real quickly and have the folks, the panelists, introduce themselves. I told them no more than 25 seconds apiece. So Sherice, you're first.
Hi, I'm Sherice Clarke. I'm an assistant professor at UC San Diego, and I do work on supporting teachers to facilitate academically rigorous instruction.
Lin?
My name is Lin Zhou. I came from IBM. What we do is we leverage the AI capability from IBM Watson, as many of you have heard about. What that means is that we create the engaging and also scalable solutions with AI technology for our partners and also our clients.
Chris?
I'm Chris Calmeyn. I'm one of the co-founders of Scout. We refer to ourselves as your personal recruiting expert. We're blending AI technologies with human intuition to help our customers hire smarter and faster.
Elijah?
Hi, I'm Elijah Mayfield. I did most of a PhD in machine learning at Carnegie Mellon, left that program to start a company called Lightside Labs, focused on improving student writing. About 2.5 years ago, I sold that startup to Turnitin, which has about 30 million students worldwide using their tools. And I'm now focused on expanding their reach and really trying to improve writing skills with some of the technologies I developed, as well as a better user experience.
Brandon?
Sure. Hi, I'm Brandon Tseng. I'm the co-founder of ShieldAI, former Navy SEAL before SHIELD, and SHIELD is building artificially intelligent systems for the Department of Defense and the federal government.
Thanks. So wide-ranging backgrounds, which will be fantastic for our discussion for the next 45 minutes or so. The first thing I wanted to do is just define intelligence. And this is actually out of the Board of Scientific Affairs. And the way they define it is a very general mental capability that, among other things, involves the ability to reason, plan, solve, think abstractly, comprehend complex ideas, learn quickly, and learn from experience. It is not merely book learning, a narrow academic skill, or test-taking smarts. Rather, it reflects on a broader and deeper capability for comprehending our surroundings, catching on, making sense of things, or figuring things out, or what to do next. So Elijah, can a computer really do that?
No. And I think that the real keywords there that are important to sort of zero in on are general and flexible. I think that much of what we've done a very good job of with technology in the last several years is figure out how to define tasks really clearly and then solve those tasks with machine learning or other artificial intelligence system. And we started out with checkers and moved to chess and then Go, and now we're driving Hondas. And that's a progression in terms of how complex the individual tasks are. But the real gap that we're still working on is how do you move into a more flexible environment where you actually don't know what the task is going to be until you're already doing it? And how can you actually solve those problems? And I think that we're quite a ways from that.
And then and also on the scholastic level, Sherice, right? So, I just defined intelligence, at least one definition of intelligence. How would you think about it as it relates to scholastic learning and AI?
Well, I mean, I totally agree with that definition, and I think as you engaged us to think about this, I wondered to what extent AI could develop those generative capacities. So we want people to learn so that they can, in new situations, they can, develop solutions that are strategic and well-reasoned, et cetera. As Elijah said, it's about developing competence that that can negotiate unforeseen future possibilities. So, I mean, if you guys can do that, rad.
And we have somebody here from the Watson team, right? So, and Watson is known as trying to beat chess champions, right? And actually trying to build on top of regular, human intelligence into artificial intelligence. So maybe you can expand on that, Lynn.
Yeah. So I'm going to share some of the other, but actually it's not really a definition to me. I think if you talk to 10 different people, you probably get 12 different interpretations of what AI is, right? Because we all carry the background. When we interpret things as human beings, we bring our contextual information behind it, which is actually the part where the AI is sometimes lagging behind. My interpretation, I said, would be probably more come from 5 dimensions of AI. One is the dimension of being able to, like human beings, when we look at a picture, when we hear a voice, we're able to recognize that information, right? And AI today actually doing pretty good. If you look at the voice recognition, our error rate is at probably 6.3%. And a typical human being, when we hear the voice, we probably made 5% error. So we are getting much closer. The AI is getting much closer, right? On the image recognition piece, with the deep neural networks, we are getting to 5%, which is actually less than 5%, 4.9 something percent, where human beings at 5%. So it's actually better. In that very specific narrow AI field, we're much better. So I think that first dimension is that how AI recognize information where like human being. Second dimension comes in as the understanding, right? Not more from understanding is infer, right? So you see one piece of example, you can generalize that to a principle, right? This is what actually the kids do in school. We first learn to read, then we start read to learn. So we can start generalize a set of ideas. And machine learning sometimes is still behind. The third piece actually coming from AI is the learning piece. Because like human beings, we do not stop. As we grow, our brain keep developing. So for AI, it's the same thing. The AI has to continue learn, right? When new data come in, start retrain. The fourth piece come from AI is interact. Goes beyond the machine-to-machine interactions, really through this natural language dialogue, conversations with human beings, right? I have a session this afternoon talk about the tutoring, where how you use the natural language processing power to interact with the student in a natural way, right? The last piece I would say is not the least, but I think it's very crucial. I always compare to human beings, which is our knowledge is not a set of rules or the common sense in our brain. We have this contextual background to be able to interpret information, and that contextual information comes from data. So the AI has a very important, the fifth dimension is that AI has to include the necessary data behind it. Right.
So maybe Brandon, you can talk about, let's take it down a level. So, a lot of people in the audience here probably don't understand like how a machine learns, right? And machines typically learn by getting more data. And the more data they get, they learn more, right? And the data that they get informs their decisions going forward. But maybe you can kind of talk a little bit about this whole kind of, not evolution, but how can a machine really learn?
Yeah, no, when I think about how a machine learns, it kind of goes back to your original question or the definition of intelligence and, can artificial intelligence do all that? And I don't think artificial intelligence has to do all that, and because it is completely different than human intelligence and how we think about learning. And so, whereas a computer can intake massive amounts of data and learn from that, it's just very different than, how a human has to do it. And so, I think, when you say, how exactly are machines learning today? Very much so. It is the ingestion of these vast amounts of raw data, and we're training them to identify certain pieces of information within that data. And then it just gets better and better, and through that reinforcement learning, you're able to, get the outcomes that you want from that data.
And when you so when you reinforce this learning, Elijah or Chris, when you reinforce this learning, does this turn into my Facebook feed where every time I click on a certain news story, I get the same type of news story over and over and over again?
That kind of segues into my favorite cautionary tale about how these systems can learn, and it's the Tay Twitter bot. I don't know how many people know about that, but this really speaks to the input of the data that you use to teach these systems. So Tay was strangely designed to be a 19-year-old female with zero chill. They're just asking to get messed with. And so within, I think, like 24 or 48 hours, she became a neo-Nazi on Twitter because she learns from the interactions of the people who were speaking with her, and people were just feeding her nonsense and terrible things. And that really just speaks to the danger of not thinking through how these systems learn. And it's crazy that they turned it off really quickly, and when they accidentally turned it back on, she started trying to sell drugs on Twitter immediately. So, we have to be very careful about how we do this, and I'm sure you can speak to that.
Yeah. So Elijah, how do we deal with that issue when AI begins to learn and start to almost discriminate against certain ways or certain types by focusing based on the data that it's already learned?
Yeah.
How do you prevent that?
Well, I think that there's a fundamental tension between wanting to curate the way that problems are solved and the way that you collect data and the exact sample that you want to build, and being really careful about means and standard deviations and being careful about different classes and how you think about what choices that you're making. That's one end where you're very carefully structured. And on the other end, it's totally unstructured, and you try and gather tens of millions, hundreds of millions of examples and just feed in as much as you possibly can. And many of the newer algorithms, especially in the last, call it 5 years, really thrive on that circumstance where you don't put any constraints on it. You just take in as much as you can, and you let it discover those patterns sort of innately. What you get with that, sort of unintentionally, is Nazis. And so you need to find some balance where there are experts that are looking at the choices that you're making about what training data you're giving to the algorithm, what labels you're asking it to assign. And some of the conversations that we have internally at our company around student writing are asking questions like, well, how prescriptive do we actually want to be? Do we want to start penalizing people who don't use sort of standard American English grammar and mechanics choice? Probably not in many circumstances, because that's actually going to end up, setting up a rich get richer paradigm where the people that already know the rules get rewarded for it by the algorithm, and the people that don't have that skill set, by nature of their upbringing, end up hurt more by the algorithm. And we spend a lot of time on conversations like that, and it comes down to what you put into the algorithm and what you let it learn from. And I think that by curating that and by putting people in a position where they can make the choices about how the models are trained, you end up with a machine learning solution that follows whatever standards or heuristics you put into the process.
So, okay, so if we put heuristics into the process that are coming from our brains, our
Yep.
human brains, and we actually have training data that's over here to ensure that our algorithm doesn't go awry, because you're ingesting all this unstructured data.
Yep.
We bring in this training data to say, okay, here's some stuff that you need to look at to ensure you don't go awry. But the people that are creating this training data, they also bring their own unconscious bias to the table, right? And so how do you prevent the unconscious bias of the people actually setting up the training data to ensure that the machine begins to learn the right way? Does anybody want to jump on that one?
So actually, I would like to approach from the other angle. Actually, I totally agree with you. There's how you carefully select the data actually brings in your own personal, view of that data, which may potentially bias the model you're going to be building. I want to share with you some perspective where with the tutoring solution we are working with Pearson. We constructed careful studies with the students. And we are very conscientious about how the tutoring solution actually impacts student learning experience. And one of the interesting things we found, actually, I think is really, from the technologists, from me, it's really eye-opening. It's saying that lots of students saying that they actually feel more comfortable to engage a virtual tutor as opposed to a real professor. And they come in from the angle saying that when they talk to a human tutor, there is always a feeling of intimidating nature, or you feel you could potentially be judged by the teacher, right? You may ask a dumb question, and the teacher may feel that you're really not understanding the concept. So by engaging this machine learning enabled with Watson, this virtual tutor, they felt that they are talking to a kind of unbiased, neutral body, and everything they say is not going to actually retribute in the later days. So they felt actually more comfortable to some extent, right? So I want to supplement what you just said from training data. I want to supplement from the user experience part. That's an interesting observation I want to share.
Sure. And Brandon, let's talk about kind of the practical. One of the things that you're involved in the application of AI is in defense, right? So why don't you talk a little bit about, and we're going to talk a little bit about the different fields and the actual applications of AI in these fields. But why don't you start with talking about the implication of it with ShieldAI specifically, and some work that you guys have done.
Yeah, sure. So I'll briefly go over ShieldAI. I have a talk this afternoon too, so if you want to hear more about it, go there. But very quickly, our mission is to protect service members and innocent civilians with artificially intelligent systems. And we are building these systems that vastly improve the decision-making cycle for service members on the ground. And that's what I think is really interesting about artificial intelligence, and it's this question, the topic of this talk is, can AI, make us smarter? Can it improve intelligence? And as I was thinking through this question, I said, well, it certainly can improve your decision-making process. The amount of data that it can ingest, analyze, and produce insights with is astounding, and the speed it can do it is incredibly quick too. So very basically, what we're doing, we're sending robots in that have AI embedded in them and that can make decisions without any human telling them where to go, and then they provide these insights on what they've seen. And so, that question of can AI improve intelligence? I think it improves decision making. Whether it improves your ability to learn, I think that's a question for another board panel member, but it certainly improves your decision-making process. And I guess it could be argued that if you are always making the best decisions, then you are a very smart person.
Yeah, and Chris, why don't you talk to AI as relates to recruiting? Because here's a practical application on the battlefield, right? But there's clearly many practical applications. One's in recruiting.
Yeah, absolutely.
And as it relates to how it improves intelligence generally.
There's a number of practical applications in recruiting. So we focus on sourcing candidates, and there's multiple tools that can be used to improve the outcomes there. So one of the things that really excites me right now is that there's so many open source libraries for natural language processing, which helps us to digest a job post and pull out key skills, also make relations between those skills and other skills and the job titles. And it's also not something that's one of our team's strengths. Our team is strongest when it comes to search and making those relationships. It's not very strong at natural language processing right now. But there's so many tools that allow us to use that to structure better queries to match people to job positions. So it's great that we can use techniques that we excel at, and we can also take advantage of ones that we don't have as much domain expertise and create a much more efficient system.
And do you really believe that artificial intelligence can tell you who to hire?
So I don't know that it necessarily tells you who to hire, but I do believe that it's a more efficient way to search for suitable candidates. It's a really tedious job, going through LinkedIn, trying to find, who has just enough Ruby on Rails experience or who has this certain skill set. And I believe that it can help to get to more suitable candidates much more quickly. And the benefit there is that people who work in talent acquisition can focus on building relationships with these candidates. They can bring in more qualified people for interviews, and then the team can judge whether or not they are indeed a good fit.
Right. So what you're saying is that it can give you kind of a shortcut to your short list of candidates, but it's not necessarily going to tell you who to hire. And so so there's a gap, right, between that's where AI stops as it relates to recruiting. When it comes to hiring, will AI ever be able to get to the point of doing stuff we're doing right now, which is eye contact and body language and voice intonation, and whether or not I could sit shoulder to shoulder with that person in the chair? Will it ever get to culture fit?
That's a great question, because I'm not even sure that those are a great judge of a good employee, of somebody who can contribute to a company. It may depend on the role. I don't think the test of whether or not I want to have a beer with somebody is the best way to decide if you want to hire someone. I do think that our focus is on sourcing candidates, so we are trying to find people who are capable. We're not necessarily analyzing whether or not they're a culture fit for that company. I do feel that there are ways do that. But I wouldn't want to try to base it on eye contact, how clever somebody is when they're speaking. And, I'd rather find other characteristics to weigh as well.
But you're not necessarily dismissing those characteristics.
It depends on the role, but no.
Sure, sure. And Elijah, maybe in your field, your company helps students, right? So maybe you can kind of talk through the application of it within your business.
Yeah, I think that a really key thing to think about when looking at the role of any tool in the classroom is how can you improve the self-efficacy and motivation aspects of student learning? How do you make it so that students want to spend the class period working on their assignment, talking with their peers about what they can do to improve their writing, going home at night and continuing to work on their essay over the course of the evening, spending their weekend on it? Those are not natural things for a 14-year-old to want, to be clear. And so one of the things that we find most interesting as we develop our tools is if you're going to give feedback to students as they're working on an essay assignment, you're not trying to replace the process of grading, the process of testing, the process of all of those. That's a broader, almost policy discussion that you need to bring governments in. It's a much bigger conversation. What we want is to see students getting feedback quickly, not getting bored and distracted and wandering off, not having to wait 2 weeks to hear from their teacher about how they're doing, but very quickly evaluate and use machine learning and natural language processing techniques to point out, here's where you could be spending more time on this if you wanted to. Here are the things that you did really well that we're recognizing as a strength of your writing. And if you were going to go for a second draft or a third draft, this is where we would point you to next. And all of that can be done in a couple of seconds with technology, with some of the machine learning that we've developed, which would, in a world without this sort of tool, take a week of time and a weekend of a teacher's sort of free hours to get that feedback for even a single round. And what we're seeing with that technology is moving students from a place where often they just write a single draft, save and then submit it, to a place where they're writing 6, 7, 12 drafts in some cases, all on their own and independently, and driving motivation and sort of students' belief that they can improve their writing by intervening faster and really getting involved at an earlier stage in their process.
And in that way, it actually, you believe that it can improve actual intelligence?
I think it can improve their motivation to improve their own intelligence, potentially, or use their intelligence to build skills, probably more accurately. And as an augment for the classroom experience, that's probably very valuable. And machine learning is able to do things that traditional tools cannot.
And Sherice, this is the field you're in, right? Like
Yeah.
You're a professor at UCSD. This is what you teach. You want to pile on to what Elijah just mentioned?
Yeah, well, I'm thinking a lot of things. One, what I'm hearing in the discussion thus far is that what you guys are thinking about sort of operates at two different sort of time scales. You're talking about, Brandon, decision making. You're both talking about decision making for a particular task. And I think what Elijah is talking about is AI to assist a task, but that it's sort of a gift that keeps on giving, in that what the affordances for student learning is that it exists beyond them working in this technology. And I think that's a really sort of important thing if we're thinking about developing capacities that are generative, that are not just about moment-to-moment decision-making, but actually, about sort of the evolution of decision-making or the evolution of thought about particular things. So, yeah.
And when you and I had a previous conversation, we talked about what the end game is, or what the end state is. Like, why are we doing all of this? Like, why does this matter? Right? So what are we trying to get out of it? Right? Everyone has their own kind of agenda. But why don't you talk through, your positions on what the end game is, and what we want to get out of as a society generally, as we get into more of a artificially intelligent world?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this is an old debate that societies have engaged with, ever since education was invented. What is education for? What kind of society do we want to have? And based on that question, how do we develop that? So, I mean, in my opinion, and probably you can tell from what I've said so far, I think we want to be able to develop individuals that can do things that we can't possibly imagine. I actually had a lunch with an MIT professor that was a physicist turned learning scientist. And I asked him why he turned to learning sciences, late in his career. And he said that he counted 4 students as Nobel laureates, and he wanted to develop more. And I thought, oh God, that's totally obnoxious. You can only ask that. You can only say that if you're a professor at MIT. But then it really made me think, like, why are we all trying to push for that? What does it mean? Like, what kind of intellect or intellective capacity would it take to develop someone like that? And I think that's a beautiful goal, and that's absolutely what we should be rooting for.
But let me play the devil's advocate to that.
Do it.
Isn't producing too much AI dumbing down society to the point where the machine will do the work?
Well, yeah. Oh, well, no. I mean, maybe. Yeah, go on.
That's like the Wall-E fear, right?
Yeah, the Wall-E
Everybody
fear?
just kind of sits back.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
drinks soda all
That's
day.
right. Everybody see Wall-E, the movie? Yeah.
That may be, but I think that an optimistic outlook could be, when society is structured from being agrarian to being more industrial, people who lived in that time couldn't imagine what the world would look like. What would people be doing? How would they spend their time? Would they be super idle? Would this be a terrible, lawless society? So I guess a very lazy society is better than like a lawless one. But I do believe that people can put their minds to better things, that they can be taught to learn better and explore topics in more detail and make connections that never would have been made without this technology. So I do believe there's an optimistic timeline for us. Maybe there's a Wall-E timeline and maybe there's the optimistic timeline. But they're both possible, but I do believe that we just can't imagine what we'll be doing with this new capacity.
Somebody else can jump in here, but you guys can contemplate how AI can be, it's almost like, when my 13-year-old kid wants to go to the calculator, he doesn't want to do the long math anymore. He just wants to go to the calculator, right? So because he's got his crutch. And so is that happening yet within AI applications?
I think one place where you are in danger of that is if you're not carefully looking at how decisions perpetuate themselves and actually make it easier to get into a really streamlined set of decision making, or even a total, backing away from the decision making and saying that you're going to accept whatever sort of comes next in the output of the system. And you could see that, the easy example is the news feed that sort of in a social media setting keeps telling you the things that you want to hear. And one of the real dangers as we look at much of this conference even, and many of the tools that we're talking about, is that it makes it easier to streamline processes, make it faster, more automatic, and doesn't necessarily encourage critical thinking skills, encourage taking a step back and asking about the broader context. And we are potentially at risk of encouraging that mindset of a very sort of practical, pragmatic approach to solving problems. But I don't think that that's necessarily the tool's fault. And I think that it's easy to overstate how much impact the machine learning can actually have versus the decision makers in businesses, in universities, in government, and in communities. And those decision makers have a lot of influence over where we take these tools and how they interact with each other. And the tools aren't going to cause that to happen necessarily. A sort of absence of critical sort of traditional liberal arts thinking might. And that's something that is worth paying attention to as we think about sort of the future of education and the priorities that we set.
And are we concerned about these machines automating away people's livelihoods?
Yeah, if I could chime in, I think there are pockets of areas where AI actually outperform human beings, right? We have seen that happening in many examples we're going to get into. But think about the education space where we are in. It is experience. Right? It is not a one-time event. It is not a one task. It is a cohort of where we are constructed experience, putting together, and it changes the students themselves. Right? So I'll give you a few concrete examples. There have been studies saying that when the tutor technology, when the tutor is properly constructed, right? When you have the scaffolding, knowledge construction, remediation, all those things built in, it can actually improve the learning gains by over 1 sigma. That's a huge, some of the experts here could correct me, that's a huge improvement, right? So that's one. The other thing is, as I said, is experience. We know when students start engaging, their performance turns to performance better. So there are also studies suggested that when we observe the students in a typical classroom, how frequently they ask questions. So the measurement says that in a typical classroom, they probably ask 0.2 questions per hour, right? Which is 5 hours, take 5 classes to get 1 question. But during the one-to-one tutoring session, right, if you and me sit down with a one-on-one session, within 1 hour, the student could ask something around 15, 20 questions. So that sheer engagement drive a tremendous transformation in how the students engage with the content versus they just simply read the text, right? So, but we know for the world we have 1.4 billion students. It is not possible for us to hire 1.4 billion teachers to do a one-on-one session, right? Just not. I would like to be part of the 1.4, but we cannot. So there has to be a question asked among ourselves. So how can we scale the best teaching and the learning experience to every student, right? How can we harvest the best knowledge and build into our tutoring system so the younger teachers, they can benefit from the more experienced teachers, right? So those are the areas where the AI coming in becomes tremendously important, right? Driving the scalability, driving the consistency between the process, right? Driving the organizational capability, not just one best teacher, but every teacher in your college, in your university, in your company become the best performer. So I think that's where the AI come in, make such a big disruption in the industry, right? And we've seen that's happening today. It's not a choice, it's a must.
Yep. Okay. So the thesis here has been that, generally speaking, as you guys can hear, is that AI makes us a little bit smarter, or helps us get to a place where we can be smarter, right? But are there places where AI can be completely replace current applications so that we don't have to rely on people as much? Anyone want to take that?
Nobody takes, I take it again.
Yeah, just take it again, Lynn.
Well, I'm going to put some food for thoughts, and please chime in. So we all heard about narrow AIs and generic AIs, right? So by saying narrow AIs is you identify a small area, much like image recognition, much like voice recognition, much like constructing more computation, right? Play chess, play Go. Constructing dialogue. In those narrow AIs, if the context is set, it's concrete. AI performs very well. We know IBM chess, IBM Deep Blue beat Jerry anyway. So in those areas, I think AIs perform really well. But it's just one step away from that narrow field. If you ask the same thing who performs very well, I think AI becomes really dumb in that field. Right?
Are there ethical implications of AI in these different fields?
Absolutely.
So what are they?
Yeah.
Somebody else jump in, and we'll jump back to Lynn there.
Well, I was thinking of other applications where somebody could be replaced, and I don't think we're there yet, but they talk about radiologists a lot, right? And the great thing about having an AI for radiology is that, and I think it speaks to what you're building in terms of trying to have something that performs better under stress, as these systems won't be stressed out, they won't be tired, maybe they weren't just in an argument. And there's a lot of benefits to having a diagnosis done that way. So I do feel that there is a benefit to potentially replacing people there, but then is there an ethical concern? Maybe it decides that person shouldn't live. But there actually are a lot of other ethical concerns. I could speak towards recruiting. So if the system is informed with biased data, then it's kind of codifying this bias into its outcomes. You know, it's making the problem worse and creating a feedback loop. And it's really just kind of depends on, it can even depend on the needs of the customers. We've had customers who've asked us to do kind of filtering we're not comfortable with. You could imagine that someone who wanted that business could build an AI to do that.
Sure. One thing you brought up is that machines seem to be really good because they're consistent from that perspective.
Yeah.
They don't need their cup of coffee in the morning.
Yeah.
They don't have to pick up their kids after school, right? Exactly. They don't get really hungry, or they don't get a big kind of like food coma after they eat, right? So all that is good, which means they're consistent. But let's go a little bit further on the ethical side of it. Are there other implications on the ethical side that you guys can think of, Brandon or Elijah?
I think there are huge ethical implications, and we briefly touched on the automation of a lot of jobs, and I actually just read an article this morning that there's a McKinsey report out there that thinks that 45% of the jobs are under threat of automation in the next 25 years, and so that is, that's transformational. That whether that's positive or negative, that's transformational, and ideally, and this is something probably that one of the other panel members can speak better to, is that AI improves people's intelligence so that we have something for these displaced roles in society for something, where now that they have this time, whether it's, they mention universal basic income, but now I have the ability, my job is now to learn. My job is now to get educated. And so I think that's it's a huge ethical implication. I don't know the right answer, but I think it's just something that people should consider in the back of their minds when they look at the impacts of the technologies that they're building.
Sure, if automation AI can automate away rote jobs or jobs that are very mechanical or repeatable, right? What's the implication of that to society generally?
Yeah, and I think it's worth remembering that the definition of AI has continually gotten harder as people just got used to computers being able to do things. And so if you tour a manufacturing plant in Germany building BMWs or whatever, there's like 6 people on the plant floor and thousands of robots building all these things. And watching these like 20-armed robots put together a car from scratch a century ago would have very clearly been magic. And now it is not AI. That's just computerized robotics. It's not a big deal. Because AI is pushed further along in the definition. We've moved the goalposts. So I think that there are ethical considerations to automation and to the removal of those rote jobs. I think it's broader than AI. It's more about the sort of increasing abilities of technology and what do we do to make sure that the people that previously had a pathway to the middle class or basically an upward mobility path have options available to them and have clear paths to building skills and to learning and to sort of improving their situation for their families in a place where there isn't necessarily a path that goes through, manufacturing or other jobs like that.
Let me kind of wrap up before we take some questions, unless somebody else wanted to weigh in there. Sherice, did you want to weigh in?
I was just going to say that, I think this is always a tension in education, the paradigms where, you make people useful, like you can do something. We, develop curriculum that makes people able to do things in society or to make them, intellectuals. And so, I think it's an interesting tension to navigate it. So, thanks for mentioning that.
If I could pile in, Steve.
I'm sorry?
If I can make another comment on this.
No, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think as AI is growing over the past many years, even with technology breakthrough, I think there are still a clear distinction between what human beings are good at and what AIs are good at, which has implications to the ethical concerns you have. I think I think my observation is the machines are really good at pattern recognitions and are very good at following a process. And because of that, it tends to be less biased. If the data part, we can address that properly, right? But human beings still have tremendous power over AI in the sense of we are much better in abstraction. You give a text, you give a passage to me, I can summarize. And also I can, in the reverse way, I can generalize. You give me an example, I can generalize with a theory for you. And in addition to that, we are very good at common sense. Human beings are good at common sense. It's this contextual information. I don't know how many of you would recall, there's a fellow called Doug Leonard. Anybody recognize that name? I think Andrew, you probably would recognize that. Doug Leonard. So he was a guy started a company called the CYC. One of the primary mission was he tried to build a rule-based common sense, right? And at the time, I think he constructed, in order to simulate humans' common sense, he created something around 15 million rules. Mm-hmm. And I don't think he's done yet with that, right? So I think that says a lot about how human beings is very different today. We are still a different species than the machines, and I think the best way to apply that really is this symbiosis way of human and machine combination. I will get into that when we talk about other examples. So as we apply AIs to any industry we do, I think there are probably 3 dimensions we need to be very careful about.
So you said that, I just caught you say that humans and machines are different species.
Yeah.
And so is Singularity coming? so when are robots taking over? When will robots become a species?
I'd like them take over, then anybody that was laughing.
I don't think the outlook is that great, at least in the US. Maybe in Europe or Canada, robots have a better chance, but I think of the hitchhiking robot that I think made it across Germany and Canada and only lasted a few days in America because they destroyed it in Philadelphia. I think Philadelphia will be like the center of the resistance, and so that will protect us all from any sort of negative outcome. I'm not so sure about the rest of the world, but I just look to that and I sleep better at night.
Yeah, so. Fair enough. Yeah. Fair enough. Anyone else have an opinion on Singularity generally?
You want to try that?
Sure.
I think we are pushing. I think we are pushing towards that Singularity. I'll give you some examples over here. Again, it says it's my observation, personal observation. I think there are. I would say there are 4 major representative events in the AI history which drive us towards that point. At some point, bio and the machine becomes unified, right? You can see combination. So I think many of us know the first thing I could recall, I would call that AI is this ELIZA. Many of you know is rule-based dialogue system, right? Which was in the 60s, very old rule-based system. And with some rules carefully constructed, it pretended to be a human behind the machine, right? Many of you probably already tried that. So, but it's still rule-based. At some point, you feel that, well, it's really reached the end of the rope. It doesn't conduct any intelligent dialogue anymore. So that's the first event, getting us towards that direction. I think the second representative event really is this IBM Deep Blue versus the chess champion, right? I don't even have to mention the name. Everyone of you knows that. Yeah. What's unique about that event is, if you think about the chess game, this is actually a competition on the computing power. So for a typical chess game, the number of possible positions, right? Some of you know the definite positions. The typical positions in a chess game is about in the 10 to the power of 43, right? 10 to the power of 43. And that's more than the total number of grains of sand on Earth, right? So it's a huge number. But what IBM machine did was different because so with this carefully constructed this machine learning and this AI capability, we could explore roughly about 2 million positions every second, right? Still, it takes a long way to explore all the 10 to the power of 43 positions. But that get the machine to the power to be able to predict the next 6 or 7 moves ahead, which is better than the human could do. And that difference breaks the tie, right? We were able to beat the chess champion. So that's actually, it's a very good example. That's it's a computing power, sheer computing power. Humans suddenly realized computing power is so important in our daily life. Sure. The third event is in a very different domain. It's really beyond the computing power is this, I said, the 4th dimension in the AI, is this being able to process the natural language. This is the Watson Jeopardy game, many of you know, in 2011, right, where Jeopardy won. So this is different from chess in the sense that it is not the precision. It's more about how you put the contextual information behind the question, understand that, and then retrieve the information and then rank it, right? If you recall this Matt Reuter and who the other guy, Matt Reuter and it come back to me. So the win is because they could figure out an answer within 2 seconds with roughly about 85% precision, right? For every question they do, 85% precision. And they are confident that they can buzz in because they are competing with the other player. So they buzz in probably 50% of the time. So in order to beat that human champion, the Watson has to understand the question in the natural language, being able to retrieve the information, rank it, and pass that threshold, right? Has to be at 90% precision within 2 seconds, and with 70% buzz rate. So that's a demonstration of how AI could actually interact with humans, in a sense of a common sense.
Yep.
The last one everybody knows is AlphaGo, right? AlphaGo is I want to say that it's impressive to me, and I want to quote somebody said to add my point. At AlphaGo, if you think about the typical Go game, it's very simple, 19 by 19 grid. Many of the people from Asia knows that. But the possible positions in AlphaGo, it's far more than chess. It's in the 10 to the power of 170. So you write 1, you write 170 zeros behind. And if I just think about how big that is, if you think about the observable universe we have today, you count every single atom in it, right? We have 10 to the power of 83 atoms. So the possible position of a Go, it's many-fold, 100 times, almost 100 times larger than that. But this technology breaks through the deep neural networks. Being able to learn, being able to train, allows us to for AlphaGo to learn. So the number one Go player in the world said a very impressive word, which really touched my heart. He said that human beings have been learning Go, have been playing Go for the past 2,000 or 3,000 years, right? We thought we figured out how to play it, but the machine has told us today, we are wrong.
Yeah.
We are wrong. And not a single one has even getting closer to the basis of Go. And he also said, going forward, is this coordination between human and machine going to lead us to a new horizon and explore all the possibilities?
So let's, if you want to jump in real quickly, I want to take a couple questions. We have about 3 minutes left.
I'd love to, because I think that the last two questions point to a fundamental problem in the way that we talk about the singularity. Those are like a clear sort of, whether it's linear, polynomial, or exponential growth, we can debate that. And clearly computers have gotten more powerful over time. It's not clear that any of that growth answers the question of what happens when they interact with a Sixers fan with a baseball bat. And I think that that's something that gets lost often, is that there's a lot of talk about the computational capacity, a lot of talk about how complex the problems are that we're solving. And I'm not sure that there's an acknowledgement that there's sort of a societal set of things that are going on and a much broader world out there. And the challenges that we're facing on an issue like housing or healthcare or any education, as everyone here knows, are drastically more likely to cause any sort of massive harm to broad swaths of society than the robots taking over. And so I would be worried about any conversation that really looks at sort of an exponential curve of number of layers in a deep neural network or anything like that, and says that that's the problem that we should be tackling, when there's sort of scarce resources to solve problems, and we still can't quite go hitchhiking across the country.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good way to close, because one of the challenges we have is that we're very disparate in our applications of AI, is that we have so many experts working on so many different things. Sometimes that gets diluted, right? And that maybe there's some really core problems that if we brought people together, we could solve maybe a little quicker. So I only have a minute left. Are any questions out there in the audience? Front row, we'll take one.
I'll share. So we're talking about AI in the context of an education conference. So we all have a perspective. I was wondering if the panel had any reflections on how young people think about AI in the context of education. they may see it very differently.
So how do young people view AI in the context of education?
You spend more time with kids than I do.
Yeah, but I don't think I've ever sort of thought about that before. You know, yeah, I don't know actually.
Somebody else talked to.
I spoke a lot. I would like to yield the little bit.
One of the panelists talked about, you know, how that it's assisted kids as they.
Yeah, and that's the work that we've done.
Yep.
And I think that kids get normalized to technology a lot faster than adults do. And they take advantage of things much more quickly with a lot less skepticism. They sort of jump headfirst into things. And so we spend a lot of time reading New Yorker articles about the impact of AI on society, and they just have an iPad app and they want to work on it. And so I've seen that the adoption is faster in those contexts in many respects. You know, childhood sort of social norms are sort of impenetrable by any of us because they sort of have their own sort of Lord of the Flies thing going on. But they definitely are quick to adopt things in a way that adults aren't necessarily.
Well, first off, I want to thank the panel for being here. Thank you guys very much. And thank you to the audience, of course. If anybody in the audience has questions for the panelists, I'm sure you guys will be around. Yeah, now you know the faces. You can put names with faces, but strict limit of 50 minutes, so we have to end here. Thank you guys very much.
All right.